Nature Conservancy as well, was going to be here, but she's working on this project with me, wasn't able to make it because she had prior engagements, but just wanted to pass on her dismay because she was like, oh, this is my favorite thing of the year. So just, props to that. Yeah, so I am current Marine Policy Fellow with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to be talking about the Washington Coastal Resilience Project, which I'll be referring to as WCRP just because that's a mouthful. And as I go through here, I'm going to be basically talking about what is the Washington Coastal Resilience Project, kind of an overview. Some of you may be familiar with some of it, there'll be some updates. And then in April, I went to all of the different Coast Marine Resource Committees and did little mini workshops, conversations there to gather information. And I'll be presenting on what we found from that and what we heard. And then some next steps moving forward. And then would just be curious to hear about what questions you might have, and then hopefully ask you all some questions as well that might be helpful for us moving forward. So, great, it's working. All right, so we know climate change is happening, right? This is a graphic of Raymond and potential sea level rise scenarios, right, between now and the year 2100. But we know that what sea level rise really going to do is compound existing flooding in most cases, a lot of it, and we know it'll get worse, but we don't necessarily know how worse, and we don't necessarily know what those probabilities are, right? Because we can say, oh, well, it might happen that much, might happen this much, might happen this much. But when we're talking about people's livelihoods and investing public dollars and really making big changes that aren't easy to make, we need more information there to actually go forward with. So Pacific County is a really good example of how sea level rise planning can happen just with the Shoreline Master Program and other policies that have been in place. But we're trying to say, all right, cool, beyond just that one way of going forward and the ways that are happening right now, how can we develop better strategies across the entire Washington coast? So it's a 3-year partnership between the Nature Conservancy, Department of Ecology, Climate Impacts Group, USGS, and Washington Sea Grants, and then some other partners as well. So a big part here is why you should care, right? And what we're trying to put forward, it's disconnection happening. No. Yeah, it's happening right here, but not happening right there. Get out the kinks early in the day. Coffee there. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what's, because this isn't seeming to move.
Down, it's moving down here.
Mm-hmm. Just restart it.
Or not restart. No.
Yeah.
She's so cute.
Thank you.
We can, I mean, this is interesting. All right, now it's back. Let's see if this does it different now.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, yeah, it's working now.
Yeah, all right.
Great.
You can just page down and just
Yeah, I think this is great. All right, so back to where we were. This is happening. Cool. All right. So, Washington Coastal Resilience Project, up and running. So the goal here is to increase regional capacity to build resilience to changes in sea level. And that's a pretty broad goal, but really what we're trying to do is produce projections that are usable, not just projections that'll sit on a shelf somewhere. And so we're starting with across the entire coast, right, producing these new numbers, new data sets for both sea level rise and vertical land movement, and then storm surge on top of that. So the idea is really trying to get a usable set of information. And then we're taking that across to the shoreline master programs, and Department of Ecology is looking at how different people are engaging with sea level rise in the shoreline master programs. They were working with local jurisdictions, Island County and Tacoma particularly, to see how their planning departments, public works departments and whatnot may use this information. And then last, definitely not least, working with the coastal marine resource committees to get a better understanding of how communities who are advocating and involved in policy themselves, so kind of working at multiple scales there to get this information accessible to different people. Okay, so once again, point this from the Onion, this isn't real. The idea is that we don't want it to just be some crusty document that just gets lost in the internet or whatever. We want it to actually have legs underneath it and kind of bring that science to action. Cool. So the existing sea level rise projections so far for Washington coast have been binned into 3 different regions, right? We have the Northwest Olympic Peninsula, the central and southern coast where we are now, and then the Puget Sound. And this is just two different time scales for it. But that's a pretty broad range geographically to plan for. And so there's a lot of room for inaccuracies there as well, because it doesn't really take into much other than just how much the sea level is rising as it's compared to the center of the earth. But what we're trying to do is take in vertical land movement into this so that we can start really getting a local, really high resolution understanding of what's happening and what we're projecting to happen. And so this is about 7 miles between all of these different points, and each of these points has a projection there that has the vertical land movement, has a storm surge, has even subsidence that we're projecting for a tsunami event or a co-seismic subsidence there. And the idea is just to really make it usable and be something that people can start to be able to actually invest behind. So vertical land movement, right? So this is how much land is moving up and down, right? So this can be from glacial retreat and rebound. It can be from just tectonics uplift as well as subsidence. But each of those here you have red is where the land's moving up 1 foot in the century, right? Pretty slow. Or moving down in the blue. So you see here up in Nia Bay and the Straits, you have it moving up, and then as well here in the southwest in Grays and Willapa, the land is moving up as well. Okay, so that's good news in a sense. And then in the Sound, and then around the central coast there, you have that going up, going down. And so then we lay that on top of the sea level rise projections that were already mentioned. Those 3 more general ideas. And so here we have red is where the sea level rise is going up, right? And then the blue is where it's only going up about 1 foot. So 2.5 feet to 1 foot. This is just kind of the median projection. So there's a lot more potentials there. But so here you see there's about 2.5 feet in the Sound. And then the areas where the land is moving upwards, we have more about 1 foot is what we're projecting, right? But that's still impactful, right? Because it's been centuries of expecting it not to be moving up. So this is kind of what that looks like in a graph form. We have, the projections are probabilistic, which is kind of the big part here that we're moving forward with, and that counties and other just jurisdictions can start to base planning and policy on, as well as hopefully investments. And so that way, we say if you're building a coffee shack, something that might be easily moved. You might want to say, oh, cool, well, I'm not really concerned about a really big sea level rise because I can just move this structure. But if you're doing, say, a highway or some critical infrastructure, a hospital, you might really want to look at these numbers that are the higher probability, because you might say, oh, well, even though there's a 1% chance that sea level rise will go up 6 feet, that's still a 1% chance that this critical infrastructure might be damaged, and that has a lot more risk for the populations. So a big way that these probabilistic numbers can be used is choosing different scenarios based on specific context that people would be planning for. Yeah, so general impacts of sea level rise, right? We have inundation, habitat loss, erosion and deposition, and saltwater intrusion, and then we have storm surge and tidal events that are also impacting that. So those specific impacts can be really costly for local communities. And so why should you care about more numbers, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to say is this isn't just more numbers. What we're trying to move forward is connecting these projections to adaptation on the ground. So kind of remember those maps I was showing that show the different ways we're plugging in with different groups, agencies, local groups. So this, I'm just going to run through what those actual products are that we're producing now. So here we have, starting at the state level, we're working with Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office, particularly through the ESRP Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program, to make sure that restoration practitioners have use for this information. And then Department of Ecology, as I mentioned earlier. So within the draft restoration guidance, we're breaking that into 3 different shore form types. First, beaches, estuaries, and embayments. And so, beaches, river deltas, and embayments. And so, within that, the idea is we had meetings in April, as well as some draft guidance that was put out to different restoration practitioners and consultants, so that to see what their uses for this would be, and then we got feedback on that, right? What's helpful? And this is really, the way it's working is really, it's a guidebook for like what are impacts and different considerations you want to take into account when you are doing different restoration projects along the shores. And then, in addition to that, we've been working with the grant programs to make sure that their criteria for funding programs incorporates the same information. So the idea there is that if you are trying to adapt for sea level rise, and particularly in a restoration context, then you have a clearer path towards that funding. So hopefully that'll increase the ability of people to be able to go after funding for climate change adaptation projects. Additionally, at the state level, we're working with the shoreline master programs, right? So a lot of people here worked with the shoreline master program in Pacific County. Yeah, I figured it sounds like there was a lot of turnout there. I wasn't around for that, but I know Molly was and could speak more. The idea here is going through all of the counties and jurisdictions that have used language around sea level rise and said, well, what works, what doesn't work? What are those lessons learned, and how can we then create documents, guidance, and kind of case studies about what those people thought based on interviews for how other jurisdictions can use that information. So with that, like a big thing is like a lot of counties you need to consider sea level rise in your planning, right? But what exactly does that mean? And so that's really where we're trying to figure out where the disconnects are between guidance and action. Then at the local jurisdiction level, Island County and Tacoma, we are working with working with Island County with their Public Works, Planning, and Department of Health, and really just seeing what the decisions they're making are. And so the idea here is not that we're just working with these groups, but what we're doing is working with those groups to say, how would you use this information, and then using that to create those documents that then would be usable for any coastal jurisdiction that might be in a similar process. So these are kind of just our guiding points. And then with City of Tacoma, we're working with their environmental services, Metro Parks there, as well as the Puyallup Tribe and the Port of Tacoma to see how this information would play into different work, particularly in the tidelands there and on Ruston Way, which is that big shoreline park they have. All right, so some things we've really learned there is that there's not a lot of need for communications resources, right? When somebody comes to a permit encounter, what do you say to them if their area is in a potential flood zone that's going to be further impacted by sea level rise? These kind of things. What do you say when you're talking within a department as well? So internal and external communications resources are what we'll be producing, as well as explanations of how the heck this is different than FEMA, right? Well, I went to, I designed for FEMA, so aren't I safe for sea level rise? And trying to really just communicate that clear so people understand how the two can work together instead of being two separate ways of going forward. And then also mapping guidance, right? So if you're a county GIS department or just whoever, how to put this into GIS and how to put the probabilistic projections into GIS and really see that in a spatial sense so it's more usable to everyone. And then also guidance for picking and using those projections. And that's what this guidance looks like in a sense. It's a big document with a lot of words, of course, but it's got 5 basic steps, right? So first, define goals and acceptable risk thresholds. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier with if you're a hospital or a highway, or if you're a candy stand, or if you're a home, right? Different projects have different degrees of acceptable risk with them, as well as different lifespans. So that's kind of going to help once you figure that out first, and then you're going to find that set of sea level rise projections, which is what we're putting out, which will be available online with all this toolkit resources that I've been kind of alluding to. And then you select solutions based on those decisions that you need to make, and then you can evaluate the impacts. And once you have those numbers, you can really start getting at these other pieces and figuring out how your specific property or site might be impacted, right? Or if it's a whole region, of course, it's just better ways for planning and more detailed planning, and also steps to walk through that with people. And so, now, how does this happen then on the local scale, right? And that's kind of what I've been working mostly on, and met with the MRCs about as well. So, delivery mechanisms, right? How does this information actually go into people's hands? So, one thing is the website, right? So, has anybody been to the Coastal Hazards Resilience Network? The Coastal Hazards Resilience Network website? Okay, yeah, if you feel, it's mostly practitioners at this point, but the idea is that we're trying to expand that and join that with the Sea Grant and Climate Impacts Group's websites to share this information better at the end of the grant in 2019. But then, in addition to that, we're developing 2 new courses for the Coastal Training Program. And so Coastal Training Program is a program by Padilla Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve and Department of Ecology. The idea is that, and NOAA as well, and the idea is that planners and other people at pretty low cost can take these courses. I've taken some, I imagine some other people here may have. They're really helpful, and they're mostly a lot in like Olympia based, and then a lot of them in Anacortes area. So guidance for mapping updated sea level rise projections is one course that will be happening. Another one is sea level rise communications, which is going to be a more general one, but about like how do you talk about sea level rise? How do you understand all this information that while I'm going through it in 30 minutes, there's like a whole lot there that's underlying and really, really detailed. How can WCRP encourage activity to meet sea level rise related community needs? And that's where I went to the Marine Resource Committees. So a big part of that is that Marine Resource Committees, amazing organizations, do cool work at a lot of different levels, but also represent a diversity of interests, right? And so I've also been following up since those meetings with everybody or some of the people who weren't there that represented specific interests, particularly tribal interests that were not at the table at some of the, particularly North Pacific coast there. So went through to North Pacific coast, Grays Harbor, Pacific, and Wakayak and MRCs. And at those meetings, did a small little workshop, I guess we could call it, where people filled out a worksheet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that there. But the idea there was to figure out what are the local sea level rise related needs and concerns. Okay, and that was April. And then since then, I've been doing a qualitative data analysis, which is looking at all of those words and ideas and thoughts that people put together and figuring out what are the common themes there. What's the way we can move forward strategically from this? That's what I'll be presenting on in a minute. And then how can we then encourage action around those priority pathways forward? And that's kind of our draft strategy moving forward. So this is the worksheet that some of the MRCs did. I'm so many online like, oh my god. But here it is. It was first we started with an issue, right? What sea level rise impact concerns you? And the idea with this is that it's called a word box, where you take a really complicated question, such as how can we plug in with the Marine Resource Committee's concerns or local concerns, and then break it down into several different questions. And then you run through that in a group format, talking through it, and then that helps kind of break it down. And then from that information, you get a lot more information than just asking one single question. So first, what was the issue that concerns you? And then who's involved, right? Who's impacted? Who makes decisions? And who works with it? Then what are your desired solutions for that problem? How? Right? What is needed to reach those solutions? What would assist? What would make that decision easier? What would make that implementation easier? And then what are the hurdles? What stands in the way of those solutions? And then we ended up adding one more question on there, which was who are influencers to those hurdles, right? Who are people who might be able to help you, give you a leg up over it? So this is kind of what they looked like. This is an example. And this one's talking about property loss and property rights. But you see, we did about 32 different worksheets, so that's 32 separate issues, but some of them had multiple issues, which ended up being about 40 issues. And then, as you can see, there was a lot of different responses for all of these questions. So we got a whole lot of information to work off of, which was great. So thanks to anybody who participated in that. Kevin participated twice, kind of. So, yeah. Right, so here, what sea level rise impact concerns you? This is that first one. And this is what we heard, right? This is just straight off of it, and straight off of all those, I grouped each of the answers into different topics. So, developed and arable land, what was one impact that was, or impact two, impact to water access, right? Docks, marinas, beaches, recreation activities, flood control, sewer plant operating systems, roads, navigability and ship traffic, and habitat, and kind of how they worked out. As you can see, here's by each county, there's X's to which ones they responded to. And so Pacific County, see, was mostly concerned with developed and arable land, beaches, and habitat. Whereas other ones say Wahkiakum really was one of the only ones that had a lot of emphasis on navigability and ship traffic, and also a lot of focus on road erosion and flooding. Whereas say North Pacific Coast, they had a lot of issues with recreation access to recreation activities, particularly around the Olympic National Park, for example. I think Grace Harbor was a little more broader around there. They mentioned everything except for navigability. So yeah, and then I'll jump to the one of the later questions, which is what stands in the way of these solutions, right? What are the hurdles? And once again, I took all those and grouped them into common themes, or common categories. And so those hurdles really were economic, information-based, network-based, right, like partnerships, and governmental action, or lack thereof, permitting and regulations, and then mental models. And these kind of were spread pretty evenly across the board with each of the counties. Though Wahkiakum had a lot more focusing on the governmental and regulations side of it. But all those kind of came out, a few themes kind of came out of that. I was thinking, well, what are the structural conditions that underlie a lot of these themes that we're hearing? And then this is kind of the general themes that we heard, right? Resources aren't available locally, that's, money mostly. Our control is elsewhere, and that kind of points to the government side, but that was connected to funding. Then lack of ability to apply the information in context, right? We have information, but how do I get it into my project? Like that kind of thing. A lot of people had barriers there. Lack of regional collaboration was a point that we heard several times, and in different ways. So just the idea of kind of that network of people who are actually working in adaptation, sharing information, right? And that's something we're trying to address through the project in different ways. And then also just sea level rise not seen as a priority. Right? So, oh yeah, well I can do that tomorrow. Right? Oh, it's not going to affect me during my lifetime, that kind of thing. So these are kind of what we were thinking of as ways that we want to keep in mind moving forward. And then finally, there's the last question of who could influence these hurdles. Right? And so this is all stuff we heard from some of y'all in the audience. Here's Pacific County on the left here, or on the right. There was pretty much, they thought that as far as the influencers there, most people were listed here, a lot of people. But the main point here is that there were 60 different people or organizations, institutions that could potentially influence these things, right? So that's a lot. But then those grouped to about 10 smaller ones. But then, so this is those same ones, just not in a chart form. So I compared those then to what's being addressed through other objectives, right? So we don't need to work out for 8 state and federal agencies and resource managers, because that's happening through the restoration guidance and whatnot. And then as far as representatives, and we were thinking, well, that's, we're kind of addressing them through these talking points within government, but also a lot of the community members and people that are on the ground would be the best people to talk to those as well. So that's definitely a group of people, the constituents are people that we want to address so that they can then bring these issues and better bring these issues to their representatives as needed. So this is where it gets kind of the computery side of it. And so I took all these information, and with all of these different themes that I had developed from what y'all said, or from what everyone said, said, all right, cool. How do those each overlay to each other, right? Where do things correspond? Where is there a lot of relationships happening? and where is their strongest relationships happening that might be the best ways to move forward with impact. So one question was like, all right, cool, what hurdles what hurdles relate to specific issues? Okay, so these are the top three, right? The top three were economic resources are a hurdle to addressing impacts to developed and arable land, right? Of course, if you don't have the money, you can't adapt. Mental models and mental models being just ways of thinking about the world, right? The government doesn't work with me, or somebody down the road should be doing it, not me, that kind of thing. Mental models, or actually one I mentioned about priority, right? Sea level rise isn't going to happen in my lifetime. That's a mental model as well, just a way of viewing the situation. Mental models are a hurdle to addressing impacts to developed and arable land. And then finally, economic resources are a hurdle to addressing impacts to roads, right? So these are all pretty kind of no-brainer when it comes down to it. But it's good to know that these are kind of the top things rising up. All right, so then how do those affect the solutions that people put forward? Well, mental models affect the ability to create setbacks in zoning, right? That makes some sense, right? Setbacks in zoning, though, that's the first time we're seeing that come up as a top solution. Economic resources affect the ability to have funding for adaptation. That's economics affect economics, and you throw that one out. Networks of adaptation affect the ability to educate the local government. That's a good thing to know. The more people that are working together, the more the government's going to listen. And mental models affect the ability to educate property owners, and then economic resources affect the ability to create setbacks in zoning. So these are kind of some pieces that we wanted to keep in mind. And then I thought, well, which hurdles impact other hurdles, right? Where do we have a problem that's making it harder to do another thing? So with all these, you see lack of economic resources compounds the ability to affect mental models, work within a network, and affect government action. Okay, cool, so how can our grant-funded project, help with economic resources? Well, we're trying to do the work where we're working with the grant programs to have better access to funding. But what if we flip it around and then we said, well, maybe if we can't necessarily get more economic resources out there, but perhaps we can affect mental models that are related to economic resources, affect that network that is connected to economic resources, and then try to affect government action as well, and to address those economic resources. So kind of coming in the back door there, or at least trying to see how different things work together. So the question then is, who should we connect with to talk more about this? Different people have different ways of learning about climate change. I'm proudly on the Ice Age side right there. It's a fun movie. But so we want to have different audiences or different messages for different audiences and work with different people to get a diversity of approaches out there. So taking all those different things we learned right there about what are the top hurdles, what are the top solutions, how do they relate to each other, and then all the different audiences we talked about. We say we want to bring all this information to these people, and then that gets into a really, really messy, nasty set of calculations that happen. But in the end, the idea here was to put all of those influencers, those audiences here, and then all of those hurdles and issues here, and see which had the most connection to each other. And this is really what we came out with, right? Is that the state agencies, local tribal local and tribal representatives, businesses and economic organizations, homeowners and community groups and nonprofits were the most influential groups for these most impactful hurdles. So I feel like that's a really good thing to learn for us at least, is that that's how we're going to move forward. But those two, as I mentioned before, are already being addressed by other parts of the grant. So our steps moving forward are really to target these three groups of people. So our next steps, we know these are the issues, but we want to develop. Yeah, okay. Our next steps, because we know the resources aren't available, lack of ability to adapt, lack of collaboration, and then the prioritization. So these are specific pieces of toolkits we're going to try to develop information around to assist those groups that we talked about. And the way we're going to do that is starting by developing adaptation case studies. That was a big thing we heard, right? The exemplary people that are actually doing this work are the people that you can learn from, because it's such a new thing, right? It doesn't matter where you are in the process of adaptation. to sea level rise, there's not a lot of other people who are doing that around the globe, much less in Washington. While there are a lot of groups and people, individuals and organizations doing this, even they, no matter how far they are, still encounter their own problems. So the idea of just learning from each other. So we're going to develop case studies that address those particular hurdles that were mentioned, right? So saying, all right, cool, well, you were able to move your home back. What funding and permits did you use? What information did you use? And who did you work with?